Okay, let's get started, folks. Thanks for joining our UC ANR Water Monthly webinar. And today I am really delighted to have Amir Haghverdi from UC Riverside. Amir is an assistant professor of irrigation and water management in Cooperative Extension in the Environmental Sciences Department. And his research really focuses on developing and disseminating scientific knowledge, practical recommendation and tools for sustainable urban and agriculture water resource management. In terms of some of the tools that he's using, he not only specializes in field-based research, but also doing a lot of remote sensing work as well as machine learning. So a wide range of expertise, Amir brings to the table. And is interested in application of advanced data acquisition and mining techniques, including remote sensing, geographical information system, as well as GPS technology. Amir received his PhD in biosystems engineering from University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And today he's going to talk about some of his recent work on irrigation management. So Amir, take it away.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the introduction. Shafiq, thanks for the opportunity. I'm really excited about this talk, and let me actually share my screen before I forget about it. So can you see my screen? Okay, good, perfect. My like everybody else, I guess I'm working remotely, so if you couldn't hear me well, let me know, and I guess turn off my. So I'm going to start with the agriculture side, and then I switch the gears and talk about the urban irrigation towards the end of my presentation. So site-specific irrigation management, precision irrigation, variability irrigation, these are the key terms that you see people talk about right now, fall under precision agriculture. So there are multiple definitions that this is one of them that we actually put together in a book that was published, I think, 2 years ago, Precision Agriculture for Sustainability. It has multiple chapters on different topics, and the chapter on irrigation, we put it together, myself and my PhD advisor, Brian Leib at the University of Tennessee. So the definition that we provided in that chapter is that basically when we talk about site-specific irrigation management, we need site-specific data, either data that farmers are collecting, and nowadays we're using advanced machinery, drones, on-the-go sensors, wireless network of sensors, so on and so forth, or public data that are available, such as remotely sensed data from Landsat, for example, from different satellites. So we need site-specific data, and then the focus of site-specific irrigation management would be to understand the processes that govern basically crop water requirements. So if you have a field that, if you go back to the area pre-precision agriculture, we basically assume that the field is uniform and applied uniform water. But under precision agriculture, we try to address variability, and usually using by implementing the cutting edge technologies such as variability irrigation machines. There are a number of topics that people have been working on in my group that are related to this, the big idea of site-specific irrigation management and optimal site-specific irrigation management. The first is how to map soil variability. For irrigation purposes specifically, this is tricky because we want to know soil hydraulic properties, field capacity, permanent wilting point at a high resolution, and these properties are hard to obtain. And then the second topic would be how to delineate management zones. How much productivity of the field would be improved potentially if you switch from uniform irrigation to site-specific irrigation management? That's another question. And how to utilize, again, this sheer volume of publicly available data, farming data, that honestly technology is ahead of us. We have farmers have been collecting data for a long time. Scientists are kind of behind that, in my opinion, too. So we need to develop tools to help them to convert that raw data to meaningful and reliable results, and that they can use to advance and improve their management. So I'm going to start with the first part of the work that we do, which is mapping field level soil variability. So I kind of mentioned that soil hydraulic properties that are really important for irrigation management are really hard to measure. So typically in the lab, we measure these properties, and it's time consuming, especially using traditional methods such as pressure plates. The very first work that I was involved in, this is a long time ago, we started using AI techniques, and I said, okay, we said, if we have big data set, and we know some of the parameters that are more easily we can measure them, such as soil texture, can we build a model, reliable model, to actually estimate soil hydraulic properties that are hard to measure? And I collaborated with quite a few soil scientists from Turkey, Belgium, Germany, and here in the States. And this was basically the key publication in 2012, that we used neural network models, again, artificial intelligence, and the results were promising. So we were able to connect the parameters of the soil that you can easily measure them to parameters that we need for irrigation management or soil hydraulic properties. A follow-up study that we work on, and this concept, for those of you who are not familiar, is called pedo transfer functions. Again, to convert basically what you have to what you need. In this case, soil water retention data, field capacity, permanent wilting point. The second study that we did, a follow-up study, we realized that in order to develop these data-driven methods, you need a reliable data set. And we started examining some scenarios that you don't have enough data, and you can see those scenarios here. If we started reducing number of measured parameters, again, this is using traditional methods of soil hydraulic properties measurement in the lab, such as pressure plates and sandboxes. And we realized that that would significantly impact the reliability of the models. So we need a reliable data set. That was the take-home message, to have a robust, to be able to develop a robust model with data-driven methods. Meanwhile, when after working on that project, I started working with some researchers in Germany, and this is a publication actually at UCR 2018, that we started using some newer methods to measure soil hydraulic properties in the lab. So these are high probes, semi-automated, or maybe I can say automated device that gives you two curves that are important. One about water retention, the second about the movement of water in the soil profile. So it measures them both at the same time, autonomously, and then it typically generates 10 times, 15 times more data than traditional methods. So we started thinking about, okay, what if we have a data set that has high resolution? We are using these AI-based models, we are training them using a sparse data set. So if we have a more dense data set, would that help? And then we published it in 2018. And then my PhD students, Amir Singh, actually picked up where I left off, and he published two papers this year, last year, 2020 and 2021, where we used international data set using this new techniques, high prob or evaporation methods, and then he got really good results that basically with using the international data sets with models that we trained, AI-based models, we were able to estimate soil hydraulic properties precisely. And for those of you who may wonder that this is more on the not applied side, maybe basic side of the story. Bear with me, I'm going to talk about it in applications as well, because most of the work that we do, if not all the projects, are applied projects. So we work on sophisticated models, but then at the end of the day, our goal is to utilize those to answer practical questions. So this is mission oriented. So this was the first publication. The second one, again, he worked on the two companion papers on soil hydraulic conductivity curve and how to basically model water movement using the same technique, and it was really promising. So actually, before I switch to this next topic, so now Amninder is working on the third part of his work, which basically we have some soil samples from California, Southern California, and some soil moisture sensors that we installed in some of our research plots. We have in situ measurements of soil hydraulic data. And then that study has not been published yet, but he got some really good preliminary results. So with the models that he built, AI-based models, and through collaboration again with some scientists in Germany and Turkey, those models actually turn out to be really good models for us, our soils, at least in Southern California and Riverside in experimental plots. He was able to utilize those models to predict some key parameters that we need them for irrigation scheduling very precisely. So I'm really happy about that. So that what I said so far is about point measurements. So either you have a soil column or soil sample that you measured in the lab, or use some of these models that we developed to get soil hydraulic properties. But at field level, when we have a 70 acres field, 100 acres field, those point measurements wouldn't be sufficient, because as I mentioned earlier, for precision agriculture and site-specific irrigation, you need a high resolution map of soil hydraulic properties, ideally. So what we usually have is, again, public data, web soil survey, satellite images, farming data, and what we need to get or find ways to translate these to a soil available water within the crop root zone. That's what we need for precision irrigation management. So another study that was conducted was to basically combine these models that I mentioned, AI-driven models, with some interpolation techniques. So basically, if you have some measurements at the field level, you collect some soil samples that is affordable, what would be the best method to interpolate and get reliable results? We use some geostatistical techniques, such as kriging, co-kriging, regression kriggings, and then the results were promising. We also went beyond that and assumed that if a grower doesn't have any soil samples, and let's say they have soil EC data that are more easily to obtain, so you map the field using on-the-go sensors. So can we still get reliable data? And the results were promising. So basically, and this is something that I need to mention again, this is a little bit of I'm going back and talking about some of the previous work. So this is a field actually in Tennessee that had substantial soil variability. You can see that there were quite a few soil types and soil textures in a single field with 2 center pivots. Right now, again, one of my students, Anish, he picked up where I left off. We realized that this EC was a good proxy in Midwest when salinity was not an issue, but here salinity may actually make things complicated. So we are working with some growers and with scientists at soil salinity lab in Riverside to see if we can actually take that salinity into account and also still use the same proxy for irrigation management. All right, so the second topic is still under the big umbrella or topic of precision agriculture, would be irrigation management zone delineation. Management zone, you would hear this if you're interested in precision agriculture, regardless of the type of input. So we are talking about water here, but even for fertilizers and pesticides, even seeding, variable rate was application of input was I guess the most promising part of the precision agriculture for a while. Still, people, when they want to think about conserving resources, they think about management zones. So if you have a big field and then you know it's variable, if you divide it to multiple sub areas that are relatively homogeneous with respect to soil and landscape attributes, that would be management zones. The ultimate goal of zoning, of course, is that we identify those areas that they need identical treatment. So, and then we treat them differently as opposed to just, let's say, irrigating the entire field at the same rate. Typically, there are two methods for zoning a field. The first one is a user-defined zone. So if I'm a grower, I have a map of soil texture, then I have a map of yield, and then I say, okay, I know that I want to really put more water where I get the highest yield. So then you are kind of using your judgment and knowledge about the field to divide your field to different subsections. But so you see some of that, but typically people use statistical methods. And then the result is, or if you work with companies, you see that they give you these color-coded maps. That usually comes from a statistical method. So there's some clustering, some algorithms that they go and look at the raw data and then group them together based on their statistical properties. And that's the part that we invested some time to take a closer look at it and see how to use this clustering for irrigation management zone delineation. I have a slide showing a center pivot system. We have some center pivots in Southern California, but the main reason that I'm showing a center pivot is that the technology first was actually developed and still, if you look at the irrigation systems, it's for overhead irrigation systems, lateral move center pivots. That is the mainstream growers, they don't use these in California. I'm aware of that, but since the technology was developed first in Midwest, it's easier to talk about it, but we are actually through a funded project by USDA trying to kind of translate these concepts to subsurface strip, surface strip, and surface irrigation systems that are more suitable for growers in Southern California. But let's take a look at this center pivot system. So uniform irrigation would be the traditional form of irrigating, and then if you switch to if you have a system that you can only play with the speed of system, then that's called sector control or pie shape zone. So you speed up, you apply less water, slow down, apply more water. And then there are systems right now that you can actually turn on and off individual nozzles or bank of sprinklers. So then you have ability to basically irrigate smaller parts of your field independently. And that would be the highest degree of control that you could have, and then you can have smaller zones and address variability with more precision. But of course, there's a price tag involved, and then that's part of the equation in practice, that if we want to switch to this sophisticated systems, would I get enough in return in terms of yield increase or water use efficiency, saving water to justify this change. By the way, before I continue, the title of topic was remote sensing. You would see that I talk about remote sensing, but it's mainly remote sensing and AI. And the remote sensing that we use the satellite-based remote sensing, drones. You would see drones. I'll talk about drones in future slides. And then ground-based remote sensing, such as EC machines. And then also we have stationary sensors and handheld sensors. So we use a wide range of tools for remote sensing, and so far I talk about mainly ground-based remote sensing. So this is again a key study on the whole concept of zoning and delineating management zones. Again, this was a work that I did back in Tennessee, and then I also worked a little bit in Nebraska when I was a faculty. But the techniques are the same. We use the same techniques here. So, but this was for a center pivot. What we did was we played with different inputs. So again, the idea is that if you have a map, such as a map that I just mentioned to you, that we can generate with using soil sampling and some of the models that we developed. We have it here, plant available water map. If you don't have, you have a yield map or you have a satellite image, let's say an NDVI map from that you can freely obtain for each field, or you have EC data. Would there be any difference in terms of how they can actually help you to delineate the management zones? And then we also look at the wide range of statistical techniques. So what we realized, at least for this specific field, was that the choice of input matters, and then remote sensing actually was promising. For this particular field, the EC data, apparent electrical conductivity, was the best proxy, and yield maps, although they use it extensively in the Midwest, was not the best proxy. And then our thought was that that's because yield is impacted by multiple parameters and then not only irrigation management. And this is a typical curve that you would get. I'm going to talk about this, I guess, in the next slide as well. So when you start cutting zones, start dividing your field to subregions, your ability to explain soil variability would increase. So the y-axis here is showing that a field that is 100% variable, and you, without zoning, and then you start delineating zone, you start explaining the variability. Of course, you have multiple curves because we use multiple inputs, but the overall trend is that if you go to 3 or 4 zones, typically your ability to explain variability would diminish. And the practical take-home message here is that we don't typically recommend farmers to, if they have this system, so they are considering to adopt such a system, to make it super complicated and have, let's say, 20, 30 zones. We saw this first in Tennessee, and then when I was in Nebraska, I worked with growers, and then here in Southern California, we see it over and over again that it seems that 3, 4 to 5 zones would be sufficient, although this is a site-specific question, so everybody should actually investigate this. But roughly speaking, we don't recommend going beyond that. Not definitely more than 10 zones, because it makes the irrigation scheduling very complicated. Choice of zoning parameter matters. I already mentioned that. And then I also talk about the yield maps that didn't provide good irrigation zones. Again, this was a case study in Tennessee. So this was a little bit of background that I developed these models and techniques. My postdoc, Akanksha, again, this is a funded project by USDA. She has started pulling these statistical models, and we realized that scientists can use these techniques, but it would be difficult for growers. Maybe not all of them, they don't have time or expertise to use these techniques. So we wanted to produce or develop a tool that is as easy as you click and you see the results. So I don't think that it would be, you can develop a tool easier than that. So you find your field, click, and I'm glad to report that we actually did that, and we will publish this tool very soon. So the focus is Southern California and desert agriculture, so Imperial County. So I think we have all these fields modeled at southern part of the Salton Sea. Which, of course, when you want to do regional scale and you still want to produce meaningful data at field level, I don't think there is. Remote sensing is the best way to do it, if not the only way. So we use Landsat data, Landsat 8 data, and we call this a variability irrigation pre-adoption assessment tool, or variability irrigation eval. We use NDVI, which is a proxy and normalized vegetation differential index that shows basically how green your field is. It's usually correlated with the health and growth of the crop, well correlated. And then typically if there is variability that is impacting growth or yield, you should be able to see it. Around 7,000 fields, we did the analysis. So first finding the fields, delineating, cropping this NDVI for each field, and then running the statistical analysis, generating the results, which went from 2 to 10 zones, calculating the variability, and then putting them all in a GIS dashboard that I'm going to show you in the next slide. So this is just one example. Again, this is basically the results of of the computational and statistical analysis that is happening in the background, going from 1 to 10 zones, how much of the variability could be explained. This is a map that we usually, when we get to 3 to 4 zones, the tool identified that as an optimum zones. When you go to the next number of zones and you cannot explain more than 10%. And then it generates a map. Of course, it's coarse resolution because Landsat is 30 meter by 30 meter. And then there are other outputs as well. Let me see. Yes, I have. Okay, a screenshot of the tool. So for first time when people use this tool, they need to actually, it's attached to also Google Maps, go and find their fields. When they click, there is a field ID. So then after that, if you know the field ID and type it, it actually goes and find the field. Or if you go and just simply find the field and click on it, then the results will pop up, and then you can see that first we report the range of the NDVI, which is the main attribute that we use for zonings. How many zones based on our analysis is the optimum number of zones. A graph that shows how much of the soil variability it can be explained if people consider more sophisticated zones. If the range of NDVI is high, not low, at least the tool would say zoning might be useful. But if the range is very low, the tool would say the field is almost uniform. And then a map would be also generated that show the locations of the zones. We call this a pre-adoption assessment, and that's because there are limitations when you use remote sensing products and do a regional assessment. So just the idea is that if people don't have access to data or are not aware of these techniques, but they kind of have this feeling that uniform irrigation may not be the best option for them, so they can use this tool, utilize it to see if tool suggests them or identify some variability and suggest some zoning might be useful, then they can take a closer look, I guess, at that particular field. All right, so you're still under agricultural water management. So I'm going to switch the gear slightly here and talk about remote sensing based and AI based yield estimation. So this is important for variability irrigation, for the things that we discussed so far, and also beyond that, overall prediction or estimation of productivity and yield is important. Early estimation of the yield is important. There are a number of applications. And also, if you want to figure out or estimate how much yield gain, basically you should expect to achieve using these sophisticated techniques, having reliable models and methods is essential. So we work on a number of projects. So I'm going back actually here to a long time ago, I guess, when I was getting my first PhD back home. So I was interested in back then in AI, when AI maybe was not that popular. So, and this concept of that is called water production function, very easy to understand and grasp. If you know if you plot applied irrigation versus yield, typically you get a curve like this for crops. It's different for each crop, but basically showing that you add more water, the yield would increase, and then you get to a point that the yield increase wouldn't be that high, or maybe you reach a plateau. Sometimes you actually see some yield diminishes if you over irrigate for crops such as, let's say, cotton, that water goes to vegetative growth as opposed to yield. So if you develop a mathematical model, then you can utilize it for economic analysis and then other analysis, irrigation scheduling, and irrigation management. So these are some of the classical models that you see, basically relating evapotranspiration to yield, relative ET to yield. What I did, I look at these models and also some of the AI models, support vector machines, neural networks, and I saw potential, and this was salinity plus water stress. I saw potential to switch to these more sophisticated techniques back then when I was a PhD student. then I took that concept, and then when I was getting my second PhD in Tennessee, and this is a grower's field center pivot. So we said, okay, our grower has a yield map, and then we swap some of the nozzles. We can create his irrigation map. He also has soil map, fertilizer map, and all of these maps that usually growers collect, at least in Midwest. Can we use some of these sophisticated models, AI-based models, and the concept of water production function to relate these parameters to develop a site-specific model? The idea, the goal was that I do something, I practice, I make some changes as a grower, and then at the end of the growing season, I sit and then feed the data to this model. And then this model helps me to answer some of what-if questions. What if I put more irrigation or practice deficit irrigation or cut water on this sandy spot, put more water on this clay spot? So what we did, we used all of these farming data and then some statistical models, neural networks, k-nearest neighbors regression. So, and the results were promising. Some of the, you can see here just some of the yield maps that we generated, and these are color coded, so you see that the yield was quite variable. The second study that I did was that sometimes you want to, you don't have that the amount of data that you need to build these models. Site-specific data, growers don't have data. What is available is remote sensing products such as satellite images. Can we utilize the satellite images and train a model, again, AI-based model, to predict yield, especially early in season, in growing season? And the key questions there was that as the season progresses, can model performs better or not? So we actually ran 25 modeling scenarios, and then under two categories. First, we said if we have multiple crop indices and feed them to the model, would that be better if one just crop index? Second, as this is Landsat, every 2 weeks you get a new image. If you incorporate that and retrain the model, would model works better? So take-home message was that the results are promising. This is again Tennessee cotton modeling using satellite images, and you see that both we had 2 years worth of data. We saw potential to basically develop such models for crop, for yield estimation early in season. And this was really, I guess, important because cotton being such a tricky crop, we were really excited about this. Then here at the University of Riverside, my PhD student Anish basically continued that line of work. So he's working with some growers, alfalfa field with Ali Muntazar, who had some site-specific yield measurements, actual yield measurements. So we got this toy that is a multispectral dual camera thermal camera. Anish called this beast. So and then he's an expert now. He's our drone guy. Although I was the first person in the group who got this license back when it was really difficult. So, but jokes aside, so what he did, he flew over these fields, 4 or 5 growers' fields, alfalfa being such an important crop in the region, and then we team up with Ali in Southern California desert, and then this is the preliminary results. We haven't published this yet. I think this is really a current, ongoing project. Anish, I think, showed me this result a week or 2 weeks ago during our meeting. I'm really happy with this. So 4 fields, you can see that very high. Basically, if the data points are correlated and are close to this line, one by one, you see the model works good. So, and this is a model based on drones. So we wanted to go beyond satellites. Nowadays, the drones are more maybe accessible and available. Again, the same questions that I asked when I was conducting my research. If we use a statistical models, actually he's using more simple models, regression based, but satellite products here, drone-based crop indices, can we provide a good estimation of yield? And you see these fields are color coded, so the model was able to actually differentiate and between different fields, and we are really happy about this result. So he needs to still look at the thermal data and see if adding thermal camera to multispectral would be beneficial. All right, so agriculture being such an important topic, I used 40 minutes of my time to talk about agriculture. Now I have 5 minutes left to talk about urban irrigation. This is also important, believe it or not. We have substantial infrastructure for urban irrigation. More than our ag work is mainly with growers. So let me try to give you some ideas and some results, take-home messages from our landscape irrigation projects. When I first started 5 years ago, so we teamed up with some C advisors, and then at the time we had around 400 research plots in Central California, Southern California, fully automated research plots with and heavily instrumented. We terminated one of our research sites at Kearney, but now we have research plots at South Coast Research and Extension Center in Orange County, and then in UC Riverside, around 8-9 irrigation trials. So we are looking at turf grass, and then also other species, more new introduction, ground covers, and native species. And then our goal is to develop water conservation strategies, of course, look at the alternative methods, recycled waters, generate evapotranspiration based information reliable for municipalities, and then also see if we can do this in a way that in residential areas people can implement it, because that's part of our clientele and it's important. So in residential areas, our focus is on smart controllers. If you're not familiar with the smart controllers, basically these are irrigation timers plus a sensor. So if you have an ET sensor or soil moisture sensor, they can regulate irrigation, and then, believe it or not, you can actually implement sophisticated deficit irrigation treatments using these controllers. This is one of the products that I'm using in my plot. So a weather-based system that talks wirelessly with a sensor and gets solar radiation data based on the latitude, combine them using Hargreaves equation, calculates evapotranspiration, reference evapotranspiration, and then if you input a plant factor and zone your area, then it implements the right amount of water. At least that's what manufacturer says. So we wanted to take a closer look at the settings, evaluate them, and compare them to CIMMYS that is more reliable. This is just one publication, just very recently published. We look at the remote sensing component here is a ground-based remote sensing. At least that's when I started this work. So we use handheld sensors to get NDVI data to show us quality difference in between agriculture and landscape. Would be the main difference is that yield is not a factor here. So we are talking about aesthetic beauty, and then and we wanted to have an objective and reliable output, so we picked NDVI. So this graph basically is showing that a model that we developed based on remote sensing data, that based on the irrigation treatment that you apply or the amount of the water conservation target that you have in mind, the quality of turf would differ, of course. And then as time progresses, you see some changes. That was, I guess, the most important part. We developed some models that people can apply, and this is for Riverside. Then we took CIMMYS data, 40 years worth of data, and feed it to the model. This is basically the outcome of that. We noticed that if you go with severe deficit irrigation treatments that sometimes is needed during the drought, 40%, let's say cutting 60%, 50% from the water level that we usually consider full irrigation for turf. You can still keep the quality at the level that you want, but for only 50 days or so, so that would be the time that you start with the full soil profile, and then you utilize that water and the crop starts show the sign of stress. But then we ran multiple scenarios. So for example, for this particular turf species, warm season turf, if you go and switch to 75% ET, then you should be able to, even over the summer, this is from May to September, October, you should be able to maintain the quality. Then Anish, my student, who actually is wearing a different hat here, putting on a different hat, he works also on landscape irrigation. He installed 300 soil moisture sensors and is interested in going to the next step, flying the drones and then see if we can generate reliable data, foreseeing drought stress, because part of the work that we do is we're targeting larger areas, golf courses, parks, highways that you can basically it would be more easy. It would be easier to manage them using drones. So we want to see if we can use the drones for early detection of drought injury or perhaps irrigation management. So this is another study, 12 different ground cover species. Is still using handheld sensors, drones, and no, I don't have any results to show you. And then also we are taking a look at, we don't want this to be a black box, physiological measurements of the crops, how the crops responds to this deficit irrigation treatment, stomatal conductance, leaf area index. This is another study. If you switch to, this is actually coming from a work that clientele actually reached out to us. They were vocal about the water allocation for recycled water users. They said that even with 100% reference evapotranspiration, you can see some salt buildup. So we started this work. We are with the support from UCANR. We will be starting the third year of this work very soon. And then we are applying recycled water, monitoring soil salinity, and then we are still collecting remote sensing data with near surface soil moisture and salinity to see if we can generate some useful applied results and also build some models that we can utilize later on. All right, so that was it. ucrwater.com, that's the website, group website. If you go there, you see the extension publications, research publications, more information about the projects. And I guess I stop here, and I would be happy to answer any question that you might have.
Wow, thanks, Amir. That's a lot. That's a lot. Questions?
Thank you.
Yeah, I will get started. So in the chart that you were showing, Amir, in terms of that yield prediction using the drone, I couldn't quite catch what those individual dots were representing, but I noticed that you can resolve the yield between different fields, but not so much within a field. And I wasn't quite sure what was happening there.
Very good question. Dots are they're measured yield data that was measured actually on site. Okay. What is happening here is that, then this is again very early in this study, we noticed that too. What is happening, I think at each field level also the model's performance are satisfactory, but the correlation is not that high. And the reason is that we didn't have that much variability within each field. So these are not variable fields. And the goal was, again, to go beyond one field and maybe look at more regional scale. So my hypothesis would be that if you have a variable soil that you see high versus low yield at one field and you have enough data, then the model would work much better at field level. But again, when we use combined data to train the models and develop them, the overall results were satisfactory. And this is coming from a bootstrapping cross-validation, so I didn't show that. So every time we took randomly part of this data set after combining them and feed them, and then each time the model worked good.
Good, thanks. Anyone else got any question? If not, then I have several.
I have a question. If I can go.
Sure.
Okay. You showed that 3D graph with NDVI and ET, where you're showing different level of ET percentage and how it's gonna affect the overall yield of the graphs. Yeah, not this. Yes, this one. I have two questions. So first, if you could explain the graph on the left again, and second, how did you try and validate the overall productivity of the grass?
Thank you. So it's, perhaps I was not clear about this. So our work on landscape irrigation, really, we don't focus on productivity and yield. It's mainly aesthetic values, and then you work basically in a simple simple term, you want to see a green grass. So we pick NDVI as a proxy. So basically lower NDVI values depict or show grass that is stressed. And then we also visually assess the quality of the grass, which is more typical. And then when we did that and we correlated those and developed a model, it turned out for this particular type of grass, 0.6 NDVI is actually cutoff value. So you want to stay above 0.6. This is a Bermuda grass, hybrid Bermuda grass. So that's, I guess, the first part. The second part is that, so we want to keep the NDVI above 0.6. And the right-hand side and left-hand side, all of these are coming from, we're showing the same thing, a regression-based model that was developed. The input was irrigation treatment, cumulative ETO that's kind of showing the time as you see, as you start imposing the treatments, and during the summer especially. Basically, the idea is that if you get a really hot, multiple hot days, you would see sign of stress earlier. And the Y, or this column here in this 3D graph, is NDVI, or the output of your work. All of these dots are actual measurements, and the surface, response surface, is actually generated using that regression model. So did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think the first part I was confused about the yield and ET. Okay, just a follow up. Have you tried and considered trying this method for larger plants, maybe trees, orchards?
We have not. No, we no,
Okay.
we started with turf. No, we are actually looking at the same methodology, trying to implement it for ground covers, but not for trees. So.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Any other question? So Amir, we use NDVI as a proxy for estimating ET in the forested systems, and I'm going to say this because I don't know much about the grassland and turf and agriculture as a whole, but we do see like a saturation effect in NDVI when estimating ET, right? NDVI kind of will max out at some point, and after that, even though the plants are using water, but it's not reflected in the NDVI. I'm just curious if you see similar effect in the turf grass or in the crops that you have looked at.
Very good question. We are we didn't actually we haven't taken a very close look at that saturation. I'm aware of that, but since we are not using this for evapotranspiration, and again, for the landscape part of the work that we do, we picked NDVI because it's first easy to grasp, and then there are handheld sensors that people use. Second is that in typical and still widely used approach is actually to visually assess them, which it could be subjective. So we are going beyond that typical method that is visual assessment. And third is that level of sensitivity that is required, as you mentioned correctly, for evapotranspiration modeling is not really required here. So we know that through this empirical modeling that NDVI is useful because exactly can tell us when drought stress signs will be visible. Actually, there are reports that you can, a few days before it's visible to naked eyes, you should be able to see based on NDVI data. So it's quite useful. For the agricultural part of the story, our approach that is kind of related to what you said is that we are looking at multiple indices. So we haven't pre-selected NDVI. So we are looking at multiple indices, and then I guess if other indices work better than NDVI, then part of that better performance might be related to this saturation.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned when you were describing that the zoning study, right, using the machine learning, and I remember you mentioned that in California, pivot is not that common, other than perhaps in grassland or maybe in alfalfa. Is there any specific reason why it's not being used anymore? It's less efficient, or what's the reason?
Oh, the people don't use overhead irrigation systems?
The pivot system, right? The one you were describing, right?
Oh, yes. I guess more senior irrigation people that have been working here in California should answer about the history of. But what I know is that it's not the predominant method of irrigation. It's maybe because in Midwest, part of it was because of the labor and type of crops that people, I guess, was in corn belt and cotton belt, and then the size of fields and the labor cost was, I think, reason. And then also we using groundwater here, importing water, using surface water, and then also different types of wide range of commodities, very diverse, and there also salinity that you can maybe wash it or do leaching more effectively using surface irrigation. So I don't know about the history, but I know. So I mentioned that is because we are aware of that, that although people live in Southern California, they have overhead irrigation system, that's not the main, what mainstream grower actually use for irrigation. It's still surface irrigation and then subsurface drip. For us, for zone delineation, that means that we have different shapes of zones. So for surface irrigation, even we envision that as strips along the field, and for subsurface drip, maybe rectangular parcels within the field. So we are working on some clustering techniques to basically be able to create zones that are valid and can be used for those type of irrigation systems.
Good, yeah, it's a good history, right? Perhaps I think we probably don't have many field crops, right? It's largely tree or row crops, right? So, yeah. Any last minute thoughts, questions from anyone else? If not, then I would like to thank Amir for taking the time and giving such a nice and in-depth presentation. So thanks, and please do join us on May 21st, sorry. And Thomas Harter will be talking about groundwater quality. So
thank you very much. Thanks for everybody for attending, and have a nice weekend.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.